Welcome everyone to the Los Angeles version of our roadshow that started in San Francisco on Monday and Sacramento Tuesday. You had Fresno yesterday, Riverside, California this morning. Here we are in Los Angeles, and then tomorrow we finish up in San Diego. And we've learned a lot. We've talked to a lot of people. We appreciate the interest in this topic. And the purpose of this conference is to talk about housing supply in California, the shortage of housing, the impact of that on virtually everyone in California, and actually it impacts the entire country. We will be presenting, I and my colleague Tobias Peter will be presenting a slide deck first, and then we'll shift to a panel discussion, and then we'll end with breakout sessions, and you have a schedule in your packet. We will then, after the breakout sessions, we will adjourn for a reception outside here alongside this room. Also want to thank the Hilton Foundation, which provided generous support to fund our work in this area, and also all of the supporters of the American Enterprise Institute, which fund the work of the AEI Housing Center. California has a real challenge, as I mentioned, about supply. The only solution to that challenge is to drive down the cost of land. And you can drive down the cost of land in a couple of ways. You can zone more land for housing, make more of it available. And if you do that, that will drive down the overall cost if you make enough additional land available. That's hard to do in California because that's viewed as sprawl, and it's viewed negatively. You can also densify areas that are right along commercial arteries, build 4, 6, 8-story high-rise apartment buildings along those areas. That's a way to add a fair amount of housing, but it ends up, there's only so much housing one can add that way. It assumes, if you assume some reasonable numbers of conversion, you're still limited given the massive shortage that California faces, limited in how much that can do. And it ends up being all rental, and you end up, California already has a problem where it's a sort of a tale of two cities, where you have a lot of very high income individuals, and you have a lot of service workers that make a lot less, and then the middle class in between tends to get somewhat hollowed out. We'll talk about that a little bit also. There's a third option, which is to take, instead of focusing on these small islands of density that you can make even denser, you can focus on the vast amount of housing that's already built, almost all of it single-family detached, some other types, smaller types, almost all of it single-family detached. And you can put what we call light touch density in those areas. There are 7 or 8 million of those lots that exist in California. There's a ton of them. And if you just convert a small percentage, 2% a year, if you were able to do that, you'd be adding over 100,000 housing units a year. California only adds or builds about 47,000 housing units in 2020. So these numbers get very large relative to what is produced in California. And so this area that I just described is a vast underutilized resource. And we've had some discussions the last few days. There are 2 other examples of vast underutilized resources in the last 20 years. One is Uber drivers. Who would have thought that there'd be a million or every million Uber drivers there are? That was an underutilized resource. There were people who were willing to drive part-time many times. They had cars, but the whole regime was this taxi system. In New York, you had to pay $1 million for a taxi medallion. But yet, once a company came up with a way to break the mode and come up with Uber and Lyft, all of a sudden you had this unleashing of hundreds and hundreds, if not a million, drivers. Well, the same thing happened with Airbnb. There are 4 million Airbnb hosts around the world. A large percentage of those are in the United States. Most of those people never had the slightest idea they were going to become innkeepers. They just happened to it. Why? Because it unleashed an underutilized resource. They had the time, they had a home, and they could use it and rent it part-time, on weekends, whatever fit their needs and desires, utilizing, again, the technology that Airbnb put together. So what we're trying to do is say there's this unutilized resource in California that can be tapped. It can be tapped if the laws will allow it to be tapped, and that's what SB 9 and SB 10 try to do and start doing, but more needs to be done. And if you do that, you can unleash not only the hidden resource of all this land and generate these extra units, you could also unleash the owners and small developers and small contractors and unleash that group. And you now have a whole new group that's developing housing that's been kind of shut out of the process because the process has gotten so expensive and difficult. And we'll see how in accessory dwelling units that's actually going on today, and there's a lot of unleashing going on there. California in 1970 was normal, meaning house prices in California were about 2.2 times the median house, the median income, and that was about the same as the rest of the country. So just 50 years ago, California was normal. It is no longer normal. Today, or in 2020, that ratio has risen from 2.2 to 8.4, and the rest of the country is about half of that. 100% of California's metros are severely overpriced, or excuse me, severe cost, have severe unaffordability. Of the top 25 severely unaffordable metros in the United States, 20 are either in California or in what we call the blast zone around California. So these policies in California aren't just affecting California, they're affecting the entire country, and it has started with Oregon and Washington and Nevada and Arizona and Utah, then it's spread further and further east to finally encompass Denver and the other cities in Colorado. And then because of work from home, this process is literally spreading across the country, and so places across the country are becoming less and less affordable, and California has had since 1990 an outmigration of, through 2020, of 3.8 million individuals. If we had the data, which we don't, but we could guess that that number is probably something like 4.2 million today. That's more than the entire city of Los Angeles population, which is a little over 4 million. So said another way, California has had outmigration of well over 4 million, and most of those have gone to other parts of the US, and many of them they took with the winnings of very high prices in California, and they were able to buy housing elsewhere and drive up the price of housing elsewhere because we have an arbitrage index that we publish because the housing elsewhere looks like a fire sale compared to California. So that's this graphic on the left. California also has a problem internally in that not only are people moving out of the state, but within the state they're moving from the coast to the interior. And you see that here where they're moving from San Francisco and Santa Clara and Los Angeles to San Bernardino, Riverside, and all those little small mountains that you see in blue are in the interior part of California where they're moving. And this is just from the working age population from 2020, 2021. Now, house prices are still very high along the coast. They're severely unaffordable along the coast, but they're getting more and more unaffordable in the interior of California. And as I said, as you move north and east of California, the same thing happens. The traditional approaches to making housing more affordable have largely failed, and there's increasing support, and you'll see it here today from some of the groups that you'll be hearing from, that there has been this failure. You'll hear from Turner, you hear from Sightline, you hear from ourselves, you hear from Mercatus. These are groups on all sides of the political spectrum, yet we're in agreement that the solution has to be more housing, it has to be more market rate housing. City Observatory cited Sightline's call for supply-oriented solutions when they said that not only can you build your way to affordable housing, but in fact, building more supply may be the only effective way to reduce pressure that is driving up rents and producing displacement. This displacement runs all the way through from first-time buyers to people that already own a home, but then they're pushed out because they can't find the next home that they need given their family needs, to creating a large percentage of the homeless problem that California, as you know, faces. We've done a lot of research on this, and we can show that adding more supply has a direct relationship with tamping down house price appreciation. And it's house price appreciation in excess of income growth that makes housing unaffordable. Remember that ratio that I mentioned, which is the median house price to the median income. If the median house price is going up faster than the median income, that ratio is getting larger. And in California, that ratio has grown statewide from 2.2 to 8.4. And that is creating this problem. And this scatter plot shows how that works. The cities, there are about 100 metros on here, and the ones in black are the fast-growing ones in terms of job growth. The ones in orange are the average, and the ones in blue are the ones that are below average. But if you focus on the ones in black, you'll see that the ones on the upper left have very high house price appreciation. But if you look at the x-axis, you see they have very low annual addition to the housing stock. And this is both single-family and multifamily stock. And you also see, if you look at the ones in black and orange, in the upper left, that California metros are heavily represented. And you'll see that also the areas that are in this blast zone, or the California effect, are also heavily represented, like Reno and Boise and Las Vegas and others. And then you see over on the lower right, where some of the fastest growing in terms of job metros in the country, Charlotte and Austin, Raleigh, are all doing much better in terms of keeping house price appreciation lower. House prices are still going up. They're just going up more slowly relative to wages, and that's, again, the key to keeping housing more affordable. We like to explain how this all works by focusing on a concept called filtering, which is a concept that was developed, coined by a land economist, urban economist, back in 1949, Richard Radcliffe. And he basically said that if you can't provide housing for very low income people that's new, just like, think about it, you can't have new cars that everyone, low income individuals can afford. New cars cost more than used cars, and new housing costs more than existing housing. And so there's a filtering process that takes from the new and then moves on to the existing housing. But if you don't build enough new housing, then the cost of the new housing is very high because there's very little of it built, and I'll explain why it's so high. And the cost of the existing housing goes up also. And so he basically said that not only can't you build for low income with new construction, but you also can't solve the problem of providing enough housing by only building at the high end. California has been trying that for many years. We know Santa Clara, the median new construction is about 2.3 million. The median existing is about 1.3 million. They build very few new houses. Very few people can afford those houses because the new ones cost something like 20 times the median income. And so very few get built, very few people can afford them. And the price of existing homes goes up as a result. And you have to build in the middle because you eventually run out of buyers who can afford those very expensive houses like Santa Clara. But if you build a lot in the middle, there are a lot more, it's the bell-shaped curve of distribution. There's a lot more people in that middle group, and they can keep buying. And as they keep buying and you keep building, that filtering process, then people are moving, and that's what this graphic shows at the bottom. And the bottom part of this shows that if you're building in the middle and people are buying a house, then somebody, that person that moved into that house, sold or left a rental that was lower cost. And then that process is by leapfrog, goes on and on until you finally get down to lower cost rentals and lower cost houses that somebody now can move into because they were freed up as somebody else moved into the next house up. That can't work very well or very effectively if you only build at the high end. And it's easy to a thought experiment that makes it easy to think about this is if you only built Ferraris and they sold for $100,000, you'd sell very few Ferraris, but the price of all existing cars would just explode because people would want cars and they'd say, well, if I can't afford a Ferrari, I have to buy what's the existing stock, and that existing stock is now worth more. That's what's happening to house prices in California, and this has been going on for a very long time. So what are the solutions? We think light touch density, which is a concept that we developed in 2019. And it represents, we think, the low-hanging fruit in zoning reform, and is cost-effective and politically palatable. And in fact, California in SB 9 and SB 10 has adopted light touch density. In fact, SB 10 is called the light touch density bill. And so light touch density are basically accessory dwelling units, smaller lots, single family, attached single family, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, small townhouses, apartment buildings, lot splits. These are all ways of having light touch density. And this moderately higher density requires less land, and land cost is a big component. It also leads to smaller structures. One of the things that's happened in the United States is structures have gotten, by and large, the trend has gotten larger and larger. There's a reason for that. As the land gets more and more expensive by making it scarce, builders have a very simple formula that we need to get the share of the new construction component, the structure, relative to the total price of the house and the cost of the land. There needs to be a ratio that makes economic sense. And that ratio, in most parts of the country, is a 80% structure, 20% land. But in places like California, with much more expensive land, it might be more like 55 or 60% structure and 40% land, in which case that dictates if you have very expensive land, you have to build a very expensive large structure on that land to make it economically viable. If you were to under-improve, then you're literally committing financial hara-kiri. You're making a new home that is under-improved for the lot. So you have to improve it a certain amount. On the other hand, if you increase the density, and cut the size of the lot, you don't have to build as an expensive unit, and we'll provide examples of that. Walkable-oriented development focuses on using light touch density and a bit more of that light touch density, a little higher, in areas that are within a 10-minute walk of commercial amenities. And turns out that California, and we have a map that shows this, mapping, a tool, 30% of all the housing in California, residential housing, is within one of these 10-minute walkable development areas. SB 9 and SB 10, what do? SB 9 basically allows homeowners to have lot splits and add 2 units on lots that were previously zoned for 1 unit. Does a number of other things that are listed here. And SB 10 allows cities to authorize construction of up to 10 units on a parcel without requiring an environmental review, which could take 5 to 10 years, and lots of times involves lawsuits for the reason it gets so extended. If it's within a transit-rich or urban infill area, we like to think of that as being akin to our walkable-oriented development, because we've defined these areas that are urbanized. They have mixed use. They have some amenities, which Tobias will talk about. We then have a menu of light touch density. We have many different types. Our basic point is that you can choose which one you want. There are many different ways of adding density, but do something. If you do nothing, then California is on a road to this two societies that are completely separate, where you have a whole group that can never have an opportunity to buy a house. Not that everyone, homeownership isn't something that everyone necessarily aspires to or needs, but they should, if they do aspire to it, they should have at least a shot at doing it. Well, in California, that's very hard to do under the current policies, and so you end up with two very different parts of society, one that's renting and one that's owning, and the ones that are owning are making lots of money because this asset that they have that is made very scarce, they think just will keep going up and up and up in value because it has been more or less for the last 50 or 60 years. With that, I will turn it over to Tobias.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So single-family detached zoning infringes on the owner's property right and it impedes the concept of the highest and best use. And I'm going to show you in one example why that's the case. So here, this is a case study from our neck of the woods from a suburb of Washington, D.C., Vienna, Virginia. And you can see the neighborhood was built in the 1950s, moderate in size. The homes were moderate in size, 1,500 square feet. The home on the left was built right in 1952. That's the typical home. But over time, as home prices increased and land value became more expensive, the owner of the right home decided to tear down the home and replace it with a McMansion. That new home is 4,200 or 4,300 square feet in size, was built in 2004. And you can see it's currently valued at about $1.7 million. The home on the left, on the other hand, is valued at $800,000. And of course, from an economic perspective, it would make a lot more sense if you could build, for example, a quadruplex where 4 units would be roughly at about 1,500 square feet each, and they would be valued at about $900,000. And hence, the combined value in the lot would be $3.6 million rather than $1.7 million. From a city's perspective, well, you could be taxing $3.6 million rather than $1.7 million. From a builder perspective, you could be building $3.6 million rather than $1.7 million. So by limiting the use to single-family detached zoning, you're coming up with a suboptimal outcome. And SB 9 and SB 10 are a step in the right direction. Single-family detached zoning also makes land artificially scarce. If you can only build 1 unit instead of 4 units, as in the prior example shown. And as a consequence, the land in California has become quite expensive. This is some work by FHFA and the AEI Housing Center, which shows that land value per acre in California is now about $2.5 million. In the states in the region, the next closest one is Colorado and Washington, which come in at about $700,000 or about 30% of California's land value. So it's a little surprise that all these people are leaving California and moving to these other places where housing and land is less expensive. And if you're moving from the Bay Area to Phoenix or to Sacramento, our research has shown that you can buy a new home for 50 cents on the dollar. But of course, the new home that you're buying looks to you like a fire sale because you're used to prices from the Bay Area. And we have more on that in our HEAT toolkit that we're also going to have a breakout session later. Second case study is from the ADU experience that California went through. And ADU were first legalized in 1982, but it took a very, very long time till we saw a meaningful supply response. The reason for that is that the legislature at the time did not keep the law simple, and it provided local jurisdictions with many pathways to impede on the process. And it took the legislature a series of laws that Emily Hamilton calls a whack-a-mole effort to preempt these local obstacles that were put in place. And in 2016, they seem to have gotten it just right. You can see it from here, from the ADU permits in Los Angeles. They started to increase. And as we heard from Nolan Gray, a lot of subsequent laws were passed, and you can see that ADUs have now taken off. The problem with SB 9 and 10 so far is that the legislature seems not to have learned from its ADU experience, And many roadblocks are still in place that allow local jurisdictions to overcome the intent of the law. Here's one case study from Palisades Park in Leonia in New Jersey, which shows that if you can overcome these obstacles that the legislature has left to local jurisdictions, you can get a massive supply response. And this is joint work with Ed Pinto and Emily Hamilton, where we looked at Palisades Park, which is a small borough just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. And back in the days, it's very landlocked, as you can see. It's been built out since the time that Ed grew up there, since the day he can remember. And neighboring town Leonia is just across the street, as you can see. But the crucial difference between the two is that they have very different land use regimes. In Leonia, you can only build single-family detached homes, versus in Palisades Park, because of a zoning quirk that dates back to the 1930s, 1- and 2-family homes are treated equally. So you have the same market for labor, the same market for lumber, the same lending on the books. However, in Palisades Park, you see a very different outcome because of the differences in the law. And since 1940, Palisades Park population has grown 154%, versus Leonia's has only grown 57%. And of course, this increase in population is driven by a massive increase in housing construction. This housing construction took place mostly during the 1980s, during the 1990s and 2000s, when home prices started to increase and land became more valuable. And it became economically viable to tear down an older unit and replace it with a duplex. This process was entirely driven by small-scale builders. The law and the higher land prices unleashed a swarm of these many small-scale builders, and the by right nature of the law enabled them to basically go ahead with their business without having to wait for a permit or for a very long approval from the city. And you can see from the right panel chart that Palisades Park today has a much newer housing stock versus Leonia's housing stock, which is also coincidentally a much smaller housing stock, is much older. Here's one example. This is a duplex from Palisades Park that was built in 2001. The lot sizes there are relatively modest, similar to California. This is a lot of 5,000 square feet, which is very the typical lot size, and each half of the duplex has about 2,000 square feet in size. The way they're dealing with this is a condo. This is working through a condominium structure where the two owners of each side share the insurance for the exterior. But apart from that, these are owner-occupied homes. As a consequence, because of this, this construction boom and this population boom in Palisades Park, the owners have actually benefited in Palisades Park. If you look at the effective property tax rate for 7 boroughs in that vicinity, you see that back in the 1990s, Palisades Park ranged in the middle of the pack in terms of its property tax rate. Because more people moved in and the city benefited from being able to tax more properties, it allowed Palisades Park to lower its tax rate, and by today, Palisades Park has the lowest tax rate amongst all the 7 boroughs. Also, another benefit from this law is that now you have more people in Palisades Park, which are driving the commercial businesses. And we're finding that commercial property values are approximately 63% more expensive per square foot, more expensive in Palisades Park than in Leonia. Of course, the businesses are happy to pay these higher values and higher property taxes because they have more business coming in. Another case study comes from Seattle, Washington. And if you look at the simplified zoning map in the lower right, you can see that the majority of the city of Seattle is zoned single family. Those are the yellow areas. You have certain pockets, those are the blue areas, that are zoned for low-rise multifamily, which is what we call light touch density. And obviously, the yellow areas are much larger, and in the yellow areas, you have 3 times as many homes as in the blue areas. But if you look at what has been built since 2000, we find that in the low-rise multifamily zone, we've added about 35% to the housing stock, versus in the single-family zone, we've added only 7%. 35% is over 20 years. It's about similar to what we found in Palisades Park, which is why we say that if you properly implement SB 9, you could add to the housing stock at about 2% per year. What's also quite telling from this case study is what has been being built. And in Seattle, what we find in the low-rise multifamily zone is that the homes that have been built are roughly right at the same price point as the existing housing stock. They are come in at about 107% of the existing housing stock. So if you used to be able to afford a home in the low-rise multifamily zone, you can also likely afford a new home there. In the single-family zone, however, what we're finding is the new homes that have been built are 142% of the existing housing stock. So those are the McMansions that are getting built. And of course, the McMansions, they are changing the neighborhood, but they're changing the neighborhood that lower-income people are now being priced out of these neighborhoods. Here's one example from Seattle. They've mostly built townhomes. They are 1,750 square feet in size, and the lot sizes are relatively modest at 1,250. So again, this would be something that would be applicable in California as well. Another case study comes from Charlotte, North Carolina, and particularly Pecan Avenue, which is the area, the street shaded in yellow on this map. And Pecan allows for 22 units per acre. So again, this is light touch density. The street over, the area in blue, is it's called the Plaza, and there we are allowing only 5 units per acre. So this is mostly single-family detached homes. And as a consequence, in the Plaza we only find 40 homes, but on the Pecan side we find 74 homes. And when we look at who is residing there, we find that the higher density areas have a greater share of renters and a greater diversity among all residents, particularly homeowners. In the Plaza, you only have 25% renters. In the Pecan street side, you have 42% renters, and these renters are also much younger. Again, if you want to avoid continuing in this road where you have a separation along income lines, light touch density is your solution to bring people of different socioeconomic statuses back together. And then here, this is just a quick picture that shows you that on the Pecan side, the home values range from 500,000 all the way up to $1 million, versus on the Pecan side, they are much more affordable at about $300,000 all the way up to $1 million. And here are some pictures what these homes look like. On the high end, on the Pecan side, this is the lower level, the lower left picture. You have single-family detached homes. Then at the median of the price range at about $350,000, you have these townhomes that have been built in 2001. And then at the lower end, at the 25th percentile, selling for about $320,000, you have these old quadruplexes that were built in the 1950s, but those are allowing many younger renters to live in this neighborhood. And then here's another example from Charlotte that shows that allowing light touch density does not necessarily need to change the nature of the neighborhood. If you look at the picture on the right, this is the typical the neighborhood's home. If you look on the far left picture, which is a 4-unit home, if you look at it from the front of the street, you can see it looks very similar to the one on the right. But if you look at it from a slight angle, which is the picture in the middle, you can see that it's actually a quadruplex, which is allowing 4 units on the lot that are selling for about $440,000, which is much more naturally affordable than the home on the right that could be selling for about $2 billion. Now I'm going to dive a little bit into our housing and economic analysis toolkit, which is we call HEAT. You have the link also here on the side, and I encourage you to check it out. We also have a breakout session on this. But this is just to kind of build your intuition. And this is an example from Santa Clara County where we've looked at all the homes that have been built since 2000. And we find that if developers are given the chance to build affordable housing, they actually can deliver. And if you have lots that are, or homes that are built as an as-built density of 2 units per acre, you're going to end up with very large houses. These homes are on average about 4,400 square feet, and they're selling for about $2.7 million. On the other hand, at 12, 13, 14 units per acre, you find that the homes are much smaller, 2,100 square feet, and they're selling for about 1.7, 1.8 million. So it's still expensive, but for Santa Clara, that's much more affordable. This near inverse negative relationship that we found in Santa Clara, here, we've looked at 200 metros, 500 counties in total, and we find the same relationship virtually all across the country. Of course, the level is slightly different because home prices are different depending on where you are, but you see the same downward sloping line from places as diverse as many Chicago metros, but we also have Cook County, which is Chicago. We have Maricopa, which is Arizona. We have Travis, which is Austin, and Washington, D.C., for example. In Los Angeles, again, this is just a little bit more complicated picture, but it's making the same point. Since 2000, Los Angeles County actually added 68,000 single-family detached homes, and they were built at a median density of 6.2 units per acre. Had the density been slightly higher at, let's say, 50% higher, let's say at 9 units per acre, an additional 34,000 units could have been built. And by consequence, these homes would have been much more naturally affordable because they would have been smaller, and the city could have been able to tax a lot more property. And then just to drive home the point, these are two examples. On the left, you have a home that is built at 5 units per acre. The lot size, of course, is about 4,800 square feet. It's quite a large home at 3,600 square feet, and it's selling for about $2.4 million. On the right, you have a home that was also recently built at 7 units per acre. It's smaller, 20% smaller at 3,000 square feet, and it is selling for $1.4 million. So again, this is $1 million cheaper. This house is $1 million cheaper than the one on the left, even though it is just within a 20 minutes driving distance from the home on the left. Our second tool in the HEAT toolkit dives into jobs, where the jobs are located and where the new housing has been built. And on the left, you see the total jobs in Los Angeles County are, they are clustered mostly downtown, but also all over the place. However, if you compare that to the new construction, you find that, well, pretty much nothing has been built, right, over the last decade. Likewise, our walkable-oriented development tool is also on the website. There we're finding, if you look at the left panel chart, that the majority of Los Angeles is actually in a walkable-oriented development as we define it, and we define it as being within a 10-minute walk to a set of commercial amenities, and these amenities are bars, restaurants, coffee shops, hardware stores, grocery stores, or pharmacies. And the right panel chart looks at the single-family detached lot sizes in Los Angeles County, and you can see that the majority of these lots are between 2,500 and 11,000 square feet. So again, if you think back to the Seattle example, it's quite feasible to build naturally affordable housing at 12,500 square feet. So again, the majority of Los Angeles is walkable, but also would be candidates for lot splits or for light touch density. We have also a fourth tool. I'm not going to go into detail on this, but this is dealing with economic viability of SB 9 and 10. We're looking at it at the property level. And finally, in terms of estimating the sheer potential of SB 9 and 10, if the legislature gets it eventually right, we think it can have quite an impact. And right now, California is adding about 47,000 units per year. We think that number could easily increase to about 120,000, 130,000 units per year. And that would go a long way over time, of course, to alleviate the housing shortage that we have in California. For the Los Angeles Metro, we found a similar thing. There, actually, the numbers are even greater because Los Angeles has very high home values, and we find that a total of up to 280,000 new units could be added over a decade entirely through market forces in the Los Angeles Metro. And those 280,000 new units, those represent about 14% of the total existing family detached housing stock. So 14% is just laying out there that can be harnessed at no additional cost to the city. And we're hoping that this presentation can go a long way of making this happen.
Thank you, Tobias. It's my pleasure to introduce David Garcia, who's the Policy Director for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation. He'll present his slides, and then after he's finished, we'll take questions and answers and take questions.
So thanks again, Ed, and thanks to your whole team for putting on this event and conversation, and for inviting myself and the Turner Center to be here too, and what I can only assume an Enterprise Institute and UC Berkeley have been able to come to agreement on an issue. But that's actually one of the reasons why I love working in housing policy. There's just, it really just transcends our typical thinking of partisanship. So that being said, again, my name is David Garcia. I'm the policy director over at the Turner Center at UC Berkeley. If you have not heard of us before, we are a housing research and policy shop that focuses on issues of housing supply and access. We have done work on a whole multitude of issues, from the cost of construction to land use reform and barriers to development to innovations in the housing space in general. Today, I'm here to talk about our recent work on what we are calling missing middle housing, what Ed and his team have called light touch density. There's a lot of overlap here. So I'm going to walk through some of our work specific to Senate Bill 9, as well as some new work we have coming out next month on barriers to the construction of missing middle housing more. But first, just a little bit of what do we mean when we talk about missing middle housing? I really like to show this picture from Opticos Architects. I think it'll come back. Yeah, there it goes. I think beautifully illustrates the concept of missing middle. Just basically think of anything larger than a single family home, but smaller than a mid-rise apartment building. And we are particularly interested in this form of housing because it has largely been, quote, missing for some time, because in most neighborhoods throughout the country, it's been illegal to build this type of housing for many decades. But that is starting to change. A lot of cities, a lot of states are being proactive about creating policies to facilitate the reintroduction of this housing typology. And so we have been doing some work understanding what this actually means, because we actually believe there's a lot of benefits to facilitating more missing middle housing. On one hand, it's actually can be more affordable than comparable single-family homes. I think Tobias's examples beautifully illustrate that. But there's also implications for combating climate change. Many times, missing middle housing fits really well into existing infill locations where there's lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower vehicle miles traveled, but also there are implications for equity as well. So to the extent that we can catalyze more infill missing middle housing types in affluent communities, we consider that to be positive. First I'm going to talk through some of our work on Senate Bill 9, which the debate about this bill rages on to this day, despite it being law for about 9 months. On one hand, you have a group of people who are really concerned about Senate Bill 9 changing the character of their neighborhood. On the other hand, you have a group of people who are really excited that Senate Bill 9 will change the character of certain neighborhoods. The reality is somewhere in between, and what we wanted to do with this analysis was to provide some data and information to inform those robust conversations. So what we did was we partnered with an organization called Mapcraft to develop a financial model of what Senate Bill 9 might be able to do. And to start, we basically tallied up all of the single-family parcels throughout the state, which, as you can see illustrated at the top of this, what we call the development funnel. About 7.5 million single-family parcels throughout the state. And of that, we whittled it down to roughly 6 million parcels based on the language in the legislation last year. And then we took those 6 million parcels and we ran it through our pro forma analysis, which takes into account economic indicators and geographic and geometric characteristics of each parcel to determine where we might actually see housing become feasible as a result of Senate Bill 9. And what we found was, out of those 7.5 million parcels throughout the state, only about 400,000 of those parcels would see any new homes become financially feasible for those individual parcels. So to put it another way, for only about 400,000 owners, was it financially advantageous per our model to actually add any new housing units. Now, an important caveat, this number is not an estimation of what would get built. It's more of a, again, analysis of what's financially feasible. And so we actually think what would get built for Senate Bill 9 is actually an order of magnitude smaller than what our estimate is, which you can see here is the bottom of that funnel. And that's for a couple reasons. The first is that even though if I am a homeowner and it may make financial sense for me to build a duplex in my backyard, I may not have access to financing to do that. And I may not just want to do it at all because I may like my backyard. I may not want to actually go to the planning department and submit a plan. It's actually quite cumbersome to develop housing even at a small scale. But probably the most important factor that the success of Senate Bill 9 hinges on is how cities themselves are interpreting and implementing the law. And that is the basis for an analysis we did earlier this summer, where we examined a handful of local SB 9 ordinances to understand how cities were interpreting this law. And because the language in the bill is so broad, cities have pretty wide authority to impose a lot of different restrictions and requirements on Senate Bill 9 projects. Some of us have probably heard about the most famous examples of the city of Woodside declaring itself a mountain lion wildlife sanctuary, or cities like Palo Alto or Pasadena using historic district designations to try and skirt applicability of Senate Bill 9. But what most cities are doing, we found, are not making the headlines. They're actually more technical in nature, but can still have the same effect of limiting the uptake of Senate Bill 9. So what we found in our examination were, we split into 4 categories, and I'll walk through them briefly here. The first thing that we found that we discovered was a theme in implementing ordinances were requirements around the unit design. So low maximum unit sizes. The bill requires 800,000 square feet minimum, and so some cities also made that the maximum. We observed some cities that had height limitations that would limit doing a 2-story unit, which would make doing something like a townhome impossible. We also observed a number of cities that were imposing affordability requirements on one or more Senate Bill 9 projects. I think some of these are put into place for good reasons. The issue we run into is that we know, based on our model, imposing affordability requirements can oftentimes make the math not work for these projects. And then on top of that, homeowners have to drive Senate Bill 9 development, and they are unlikely to know how to income qualify a tenant or a buyer, for example. We also observed a number of requirements around the land itself, so requiring courtyards or certain mature tree types or hedges that were 7 feet high. And so all of these have a similar impact in limiting the feasibility of Senate Bill 9 home. And then lastly, we also observed that a number of requirements that were imposed on Senate Bill 9 projects did not apply to single-family homes. So you would have, my favorite example is one city that requires Senate Bill 9 homes to be certified LEED Platinum, but not require that of the single-family home. So we observed a number of these contradictions in our analysis. So in addition to looking specifically at Senate Bill 9, we've also been interested more broadly in the topic of missing middle housing. Specifically, is changing the zoning enough to actually get missing middle built? And so to answer this question, earlier this year, we undertook some research where we convened a series of roundtable conversations with folks across the country who are actually trying to build this stuff. And so not just in California, but in places like Portland and Minneapolis, which have also tried to change their zoning to make it easier to build. And so I'll walk through some of what we heard in those conversations really quickly. But what we heard by and large is that changing zoning by itself is not enough to facilitate missing middle housing. There are a number of other reforms and changes that need to be made in order for these projects to actually work. So for example, the image you see here is from the city of Portland's residential infill program. And essentially the concept here is that the actual structure that is allowed to be built on the lot expands based on the number of units that is proposed by a developer or a homeowner. This was not the case in Minneapolis, where they actually kept the single-family home standards for up to 3 units, which severely limits what you can do if you would like to build more than one home on those lots. We also heard from a lot of folks in these roundtables that allowing duplexes and triplexes, which is what a lot of cities are doing, is not oftentimes enough to make the project financially feasible. Because of the high cost of construction, and particularly in California, the high cost of land, you may need to get to 6 to 8 to 10 units per parcel to actually make this stuff financially feasible. And so not to say that we need to allow 10 units on every single parcel, but if cities are serious about seeing missing middle housing being built, they probably should think about understanding what that tipping point is as far as the number of units and feasibility. And then there are a number of other issues that I'll touch on just quickly. So the lack of clarity on subdivision rules, on utility connections complicates the process and can add cost as well. We did hear that there is a lot of enthusiasm about kind of creating an industry around missing middle housing. Most folks who are well positioned to build duplexes and triplexes are small contractors today. They build additions, accessory dwelling units, things like that. They are likely to be the beneficiaries of these policies, not necessarily large scale developers, more of your developer homeowner or again your small general contractor. But we also observe that a clear and efficient approval process is really key to making this stuff work as well. So not just changing the zoning, but empowering the staff and the folks at the planning counter to really get these projects to the finish line. And then one last point on the topic of financing, we heard that a lot of folks don't have access to more traditional forms of debt and equity. They don't have loans from big banks or access to equity from pension funds or anything like that. They rely on local banks and credit unions and local wealthy individuals to fill equity gaps. So on one hand, we heard that was really advantageous because these institutions or these individuals are willing to take lower returns because they're in the community, they see the result more directly. At the same time, this is not a great way to scale, right? There's only so many rich individuals who are interested in housing that you can go to for equity to build a house. So we need to think about our financing system and how we can tweak that to get more easier financing to these kinds of projects. So what can we do? We have a through line through all this work with our recommendations, and I'll quickly summarize them here. But basically, at the state level, we need to create some standards for missing middle housing. Tobias mentioned the accessory dwelling unit experience here in California. I think that provides a really great example where the state needed to come in and make several subsequent changes to ADU law to actually get the projects to get ADUs to scale. And so I think we'll see a similar trajectory here for Senate Bill 9. And then at the local level, right, the SB 9 is the minimum. Cities who are really serious about creating more housing, they don't need to wait for the state to do anything, right? They can do this themselves. The state has given them some tools. Let's just Senate Bill 10 to do that. We have observed some cities who are proactively trying to think of ways to facilitate missing middle housing on their own. For example, the city of Berkeley has declared that they would like to allow fourplexes citywide. We've noted the city of San Diego as another great example of a city being very proactive about getting more small-scale housing built. And then lastly, it's not all about just the zoning changes or the big headline-grabbing policy changes. A lot of it has to do with process at the planning counter. There are a lot of strategies that cities can employ, creating pre-approved plans, having dedicated staff for missing middle projects that can really cut down on the time, cost, and confusion of building this stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I'll just note that if you are interested in any of the other work that we do, not just in the missing middle space, but in housing in general, please feel free to visit our website or talk to me after the event. Happy to chat more. But again, want to thank Ed and his team for the opportunity to join the conversation today. And I'll turn it back over to Ed. So thank you very much.
When you ask your question, please raise your hand first and then say it loudly because we're being recorded, and that way it'll all be picked up. And Hannah has a mic that she'll bring over to you, so ready for questions. Okay, we've got one on the right and one on the left.
Hi, thanks, sir. Testing, there we go. Hi, thanks for the time. So I'm just trying to reconcile when you talk about like Virginia and the difference between the 3.6 million and the 1.7 and a tax base, and then a city like, I forgot the California one that's saying it's a wildlife refuge for mountain lions, right? Yeah, so that to me seems like NIMBY, right? Not in my backyard. But how much does it resonate with these cities that they can increase their tax base by doing this? And is that a talking point that you can take nationally?
Well, that's a great question. And we really just stumbled on this relationship. And when we met with David and others at Turner, a couple months ago, and we were showing them our work that Tobias went through with the 200 metros, I think David or colleagues said, oh yeah, we've heard anecdotes of this, but we never could prove it. Instinctively it makes sense, but we never could really demonstrate it. So this is research that we just have developed in the last few months, and as we started looking at ways of making stronger arguments, and we stumbled on this relationship that we could then demonstrate with this tool. And then we put it out in the toolkit. We're just starting to put it out there. We talked to the head of on Tuesday when we were in Sacramento, the head of the Builders Association, the State Builders Association, and showed them the toolkit. And so we think this is going to seep into the discussion, but the research had to be done first.
I'll just add to that California is very unique because of our property tax structure. And I think for a lot of planners and elected officials, it has been hammered into their head that housing doesn't pay for itself, whether or not that's actually true. So there are, I think, a lot of instances where you would see new development actually would pay for itself and then some, particularly infill developments where the infrastructure is largely there. Thanks to Ed and his team for putting together some hard data to be able to make that point, and I know some other folks have done similar analyses. But generally speaking, yes, it does take some handholding and some education to get either a city official or an elected official to really get the math behind this, and that generally speaking, it's going to be positive for them, particularly if we start looking at the reutilization of old retail and commercial sites where, before everything was driven by sales tax. And now that equation is quite different. And it turns out housing could actually be a way to get more revenue than is likely to happen in the future because of changes in retail trends.
Yeah, and we have, just to add to this, we have this whole menu out there that Ed went through on the outset. But oftentimes it's just, really small tweaks that can make a big difference. As a city, you have discretion about how large or small you're assigning these different parcels. So if you make them just a little bit smaller, you can automatically nudge the developers to build smaller homes, which are more naturally affordable.
The other thing that we think these data are going to be helpful in demonstrating to policymakers is there's an assumption, both by NIMBY groups, homeowners, and policymakers, that developers are just raping and pillaging. Why are they building only expensive housing? And we can now show, wait a minute, they're building expensive housing because you set the density at a point where, when given the price of the land, which you've driven up through scarcity, the only thing they can build on it is an expensive house. And so if you look at that's why do you end up with McMansions? You end up with McMansions if you tear down on a property that's worth $1 million, just to keep the numbers simple. You tear down a house that has a depreciated value of $100,000, the land's $900,000. You cannot put another $100,000 structure on it. You can't put a $500,000 structure on it. You have to put a $2 million structure on that property in order to make it economically viable. So you end up with a $3 million structure replacing a $1 million property. That's the way the math works. Now, if you allow, as Tobias said, if you allow 4 structures to be built, then all of a sudden you're not going to end up with 4 $3 million structures. You're going to end up with whatever, maybe 3 or $4 million structures or $800,000 structures. That's a lot better than ending up, for purposes of addressing the housing supply issue. And so we think we can also demonstrate that through the data, because it shows this corresponding line that applies everywhere in the United States. It can't be a coincidence that everybody is doing the same thing. It's because of the way zoning works in the United States. There was a question over here.
Hello. Hi. Hey, this is sort of a David question, but maybe for everyone. It's been a while since I've read the SB 9 report you guys did, so I can't remember how much you got into this, but you sort of alluded to this in your comments about, does someone want to, maybe they like their backyard or whatever. And to me, when I was watching the Bill Take Shape, the sort of poison pill from my perspective was when they put in this, you have to occupy the unit for 3 years minimum after you convert it, right? And that essentially means you have to say, like, live off-site or live on your site for a couple of years while all this happens, and then live there for 3 more years, and you basically take any sort of market forces more or less out of this picture. When I heard that, I just thought, oh, this bill's basically trivial. So, I mean, how did you guys think about that in general? And, I didn't even notice that as kind of one of the barriers, but to me, that was like, this bill's kind of done before it even started.
That's a great point. So the owner occupancy requirement was put in after we did our analysis. We put in, I think, something to account for that after the fact, and we did observe a drop in interest. But I think it was very back of the envelope. I don't think really captures the impact of having the owner occupancy requirement. That said, I do think part of that was done like for political reasons, right? And so, but the effect is very real. So we have informally chatted with different planning departments, different cities across the state, and I think the most SB9 applications we've heard that have been submitted in any jurisdiction is one. So it's very clearly going to be a challenge moving forward. There used to be owner occupancy requirements for accessory dwelling units as well. It wasn't until Assembly Bill 881 passed a few years ago where that requirement was taken off, and now you see kind of an increase in ADUs as well. So I think Senate Bill 9 will take a similar path where the bill passed the way it needed to be politically feasible, and now that it is law, it's much easier to go back and strategically make changes to actually make it work better. Unfortunately, that is how the political process works, and we don't get to implement the perfect bill right from the start.
And I think I agree with what David said, which is that the standard should be what's applicable to single-family owner-occupied dwellings or single-family homes. If single-family homes can be occupied regardless of income, you can rent out a home. You don't have to comply with the LEED Platinum. You don't have to put in these mature trees. Whatever those requirements are for a single-family new construction, those should be the requirements for whatever we're doing of light touch density. The rule that unfortunately the federal government was involved in creating this back 100 years ago for single-family detached, and then everything else was literally called multifamily. So a 2-unit, 3-unit, 4-unit. So back, the reason it's called, in part called the missing middle, or we call it light touch density, is because back in the early 20th century, a duplex or a triplex or a quadruplex was just normal in a residential neighborhood. That was all considered sort of single-family type housing, single-family sized housing. And we've got away from that. But if you think about federal financing calls single-family 1 to 4. So single-family 1 to 4 financing is 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 units, 4 units. It also includes any townhouse. Each townhouse is considered 1 unit. That's a single-family attached 1, and then a condo that is sold as a condo. It could be rented, but it's sold as an individual condo. That's also a single-family 1. So the financing definition for the federal government is a much broader financing definition that includes virtually all of these things that we're talking about in terms of light touch density. Any other? Go ahead.
Sorry, I wanted to add. I was thinking about your question again, Jason, and I realized when we had that back of the envelope kind of check for the owner occupancy impact, the impact wasn't that great, mostly because the model showed that it wasn't the new construction lot split that was most financially advantageous most of the times. It was the creation of a duplex out of an existing home, which did not require the owner occupancy, I think. There's a lot of other smart people here. I think that's right. And so where we thought it would actually be pretty significant, it actually wasn't as much because the new construction just doesn't pencil that well, but the duplex conversion does.
Question on the right.
Thank you for hosting this important conversation and shedding some light. I'm a realtor. I'm also a multifamily owner. And one question I had is there or should there be a minimum lot size in which you could put an ADU or a duplex or fourplex? What I did notice on the Palisades Park properties was that those were a hefty 12,000 square feet. And if you look throughout the city of Los Angeles, 7,000 square feet in the inner city is considered a pretty generous lot size. So that being said, how do you fit the number of units to the number of square footage of the parcel? And then zoning is another question too. There's so many zoning for residential, like how does that come into play? And obviously, because we're in different cities with different jurisdictions, LA is different than Glendale. Like, how does all that come into play? Because I do agree there needs to be some type of standard across the board, across the state. But considering every jurisdiction has different, different either criteria or standards, how do you take all that into account?
Tobias, you want to address the Palisades Park?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I think the examples from Palisades Park and from Seattle as well, and from Houston, I think that those examples show that you don't need a lot of land to really increase the density. So.
Yeah, there are no 12,000
Yeah.
square foot lots in Palisades Park.
Yeah.
I think there was a misunderstanding.
Yeah, I think.
No, that was
in Seattle they are 1,250. The new ones they're doing in Seattle are 1,250, and in Houston the new ones that they're doing, I think they're 1,400 square feet. In Palisades Park, the lot sizes are generally 5,000 square feet, and then they're kind of, if you divide them into two, you get 2,500. I mean, to some extent, it also kind of depends on how high you can build, right? I mean, if at some point, if the lot gets very small, your height requirements are going to kick in, or your floor area ratio is going to kick in. So there are ways to limit what you can build on smaller lots. But generally, I mean, I think that the beauty of the free market system is that you can have different laboratories, and cities and states can experiment with what works for them. And kind of some of these cities, they have the distinct charm because they have been experimenting. If you think about Boston, you have these triple deckers that are that's quite famous for. In other parts of the country, you have other different land use forms that they're famous for. So I would be kind of in favor of not coming in with a one-size-fits-all solution, but really kind of putting in the broad parameters at the state level, but then letting the jurisdiction kind of play around with what works for them.
And I think the lot split for SB 9, if you can't have a lot smaller than 1,200 square feet. So that is something the state. So there are two things on the lot split, particularly. One is one of the split lots can't be less than 40% of the total, so that you have a 60-40 split or anything in between, but you can't have less than 40%. And the other is no split lot can be less than 1,200 square feet.
Testing. Thank you for clarifying. And another thing too, like take the city of Glendale, for example. They've taken down so many buildings, and these big developers who we all pretty much know who they are, the big residential communities, they've put like anywhere from 300 to 500 unit buildings there. So is that a separate conversation? I guess they built that way before SB 9 and 10 were even an issue. But that's a different type of...
That's a different conversation, yeah. This is what do you do with single-family detached zoning, of which something like 70% of the lots in California have that zoning designation? What do you do with those to increase density in a way and to provide additional supply using light touch density?
Thanks.
Question here on the left.
Thank you. I kind of wanted to ask a question more about the equity piece of building new housing. You were talking before about walkable-oriented development and some of the limitations on SB 9 in terms of requiring open space. How do you think local municipalities should be thoughtful about when you're building housing in communities who, for example, may not have like commercial interests or business interests that really make complete, when you talk about like complete streets, for example, and making sure that people are having a walkable community who don't have those commercial interests or don't have like green spaces in their own community, how do you think local cities should be approaching adding density in those areas?
So I think there's two ways to do it, and one way is to do it thoughtfully through like a community process where you actually figure out what the community would like to see out of new development types, and maybe it's not just specific to duplex development, but it could be mid-rise, high-rise development too, right? It's not just incumbent upon one homeowner who wants to build something in their backyard to upgrade the sidewalk. That being said, the examples I raised are cities that were clearly doing this in bad faith, right? So they weren't really concerned that there was a loss of green space. They wanted to just curtail the applicability of that law. So one of the things that I like to say is, cities should engage on things like specific plans or other types of plans where you have these important conversations at the start before new development comes in, so you can take advantage of that value once it actually gets there, rather than have like a project by project fight over what the community benefits should be or what the streetscape should be. All that should be done up front. And California has been really good about trying to give dollars and resources to cities to do that important upfront planning work. Because if you don't do it, then we do get into these fights over one unit or one building every single time, like without fail. So I just think that's really key too, is differentiating between the cities who are actually trying to do what's in the best interests of the residents versus cities that are being pressured to use the vague language of the law to impose things like tall hedges or trees or what have you, not because they actually want to see more trees.
So about 2 months ago, I had a conversation with the mayor of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she had a goal and a vision, which she was trying to get to, which was every house would be within 10 minutes of a park, 10 minutes walk of a park. That would make more sense to say, we're going to decide that your backyard has to be that park when it's your property and you want to build another housing unit. I would argue that for private property purposes, let's put more housing units on private property. Let's let the public, the locality, put in the parks. And if you need a vest pocket park, then put in a vest pocket park. Don't put that onus on the property owner. One more question here.
Thank you for your time and this presentation. I think Los Angeles is carving out, they have a carve out where if you live in a hillside or high fire, that SB 9 is not applicable. And I'm just wondering, I've heard that 30%-ish of Los Angeles is hillside communities, but yet they seem to be kind of hiding behind this. And I'm just curious about your thoughts. And do you see that changing in the future?
That's a really good question. In our model, we excluded areas in high fire zones. Cities have the option to allow for it in high fire severity zones, but our assumption was that most cities were going to take those areas off the table, either because there are real concerns about building in high fire zones, but also because it was a way to curtail the applicability of the law, particularly in areas that are pretty affluent, right? In most cases, your areas in high fire severity zones are more affluent communities. I think it's a tricky balance, and I don't have a great solution for that, because it's very clearly a problem in California. Is our now seasonal experience with fires in populated areas. That said, I do think there are ways to thread the needle where you're not letting affluent communities completely off the hook by saying, well, we're at high risk of fire, we just can't have more people live here, but also creating strategies and plans so that there is proper egress so people can get out if there's an emergency, and requiring certain building standards so that new buildings can reasonably be protected and defensed in the event of a wildfire. So yeah.
In any event, whatever the decision is, there's plenty of land that doesn't meet those requirements that could be used. But again, all supply in the direction of adding, all efforts in the direction of adding more supply are appropriate. So we need to shift to the breakout sessions. Oh, I'm sorry, what?
The panel.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. We need to shift to the panel, which will start as soon as we clear the stage. And we've got our panel discussion, moderating, Hamilton, Senior Research Cata Center, Nolan Gray, Research Director at California YIMBY, Michael Anderson, Senior Housing Researcher and Transportation Lead at the Sightline Institute, and Major Frizzell from the Salvation Army. And I will start by asking a few, well, first of all, I'll ask each panelist to just introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their work that pertains to the topic at hand, and then we'll get into some questions. So, Major, you want to start?
Hello, I'm Major Ethan Frizzell. I serve with the Salvation Army right now in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Just like California, except completely different. I came into the space after working in New Orleans post-Katrina. We were there for 3 years after the storm. You can talk about a housing crisis when the housing has disappeared. And how do you get people housed again? From there, I had the privilege of serving along the Gulf Coast in Florida, namely Sarasota, that has no housing availability. I served in the meanest city in the USA when it comes to homelessness. And the media love to come and talk about that. But within 3 years, we ended up having a 63% reduction in homelessness in a place where it's impossible to house people. Moving from there to Nashville, a quickly gentrified city where prices were changing and the workforce was moving, and now to Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. So it's interesting to see this conversation around the country and using data to come up with the best practices to make sure that your neighbors are housed in order to make sure that people can experience the same quality of life in community.
Michael Anderson with the Sightline Institute. We are a sustainability think tank in the Pacific Northwest. I'm based in Portland, and I was involved in Oregon's effort in 2019 to pass a fourplex bill at the state level. So we're running just like slightly ahead of California in policy development, and maybe some of our outcomes can inform that. I'll be talking about that.
I'm Emily Hamilton. I'm an economist at the Mercatus Center. I study the relationship between zoning rules and housing affordability. And some of my favorite topics are scalable models of infill development, including the Palisades Park duplex that Tobias and Ed talked about, and the Houston townhouse, which Nolan's also a big fan of.
Hi, my name is Nolan Gray. I'm research director at California YIMBY. I'm a professional city planner. I have a book out on zoning called Arbitrary Lines, and it's great to be here. Welcome to LA, where of course we've solved housing affordability. So for everyone visiting, we have a lot to teach. Thanks.
Well, thank you, panelists, for participating. Let me start with you, Emily. You were involved with Tobias and me in coming up with the ebook on light touch density. Can you talk about what you think the opportunities are for light touch density on a national scale, and then how it ties back into California?
Sure. So across the country, I am most optimistic about seeing reforms that really work take place at the state level. And California is a large part of my optimism there, in spite of the enormous housing affordability problem based on the success of ADU legislation that we've seen here, which state policymakers in many other parts of the country are copying with ADU bills of their own, as well as bills that set limits on other areas of local zoning rules. Within the light touch density framework, I'm particularly interested in small lot single family development because that is something that we've seen be very scalable. And in Palisades Park, the duplex is very close to single family development. In fact, we see in the census data that many duplex owners consider their half of the duplex a single family attached unit. And so I would love to see that work at the state level in the form of state laws that set limits on how large local minimum lot size requirements can be in areas that are served by sewer and water infrastructure.
Thank you. Michael, Gainesville, Florida got a little national attention. They passed a light touch density bill that would have allowed 2 to 4 unit development within Gainesville, and the state, one of the state departments pushed back and said that didn't adequately deal with the need for, quote, affordable housing, close quote, which affordable housing in the United States is really a code word for subsidized housing. That's why I tend to use the term naturally affordable, because naturally affordable is without subsidy, and then affordable housing ends up being subsidized. So I heard you earlier, Michael, mention that the need to push back in Oregon on this issue of imposing affordability requirements. Can you talk about what arguments you have used and found to be successful in that?
Sure. So I want to talk in the context of the Portland conversation that started before the Oregon conversation. So a quick history of how things went down in Portland. We were arguing for 4 years about how to get a Plex legalization done in the city. And it became sort of a circular firing squad between the center left and the more left people over how much of this should be like only with affordability required and how much of it should be by right. And then meanwhile, the NIMBYs are like very happy with the status quo, and everybody was all the elected officials are running and scared of the rich white homeowners. So the state then came in with a law that said you have to go to 4 units by right, period. And once the status quo was off the table, once the city was no longer able to pretend that it could please everybody, that it could come up with some magical mathematical formula, it was going to be the correct one, it said, okay, sorry, NIMBYs, you lose. What we're going to do is we're going to say 4 units on any lot, and then we're going to go beyond that to 6 units with an affordability standard. And that finally brought everybody on the left side of the aisle together, and we were able to pass this with huge numbers on the city level. And it was a wonderful day. The NIMBYs were completely vanquished. So if we had not had that conversation, and if the state had not said, you need to allow some just straight up, don't worry about too many rules, just let people do what they want, even if they're nonprofit housing and they want to build without jumping through the hoops, then we would never have gotten to the ability to build the number of units we have. So if I can, in Portland, in the last year, it's been in place for a year, the city's built 380 units under the new zoning. That's 32 per month, Christian. And it's not a ton. It's not a tiny number. Only 6 of them are under the 6-plex affordable requirement. I hope that would be more. In the future, I hope that'll scale up. I hope all of these will scale up. I've got some thoughts on what would do that, but that gives you a sense of like the scale of the importance of letting some of these be market rate as well.
So how many housing units are sort of theoretically eligible in Portland for this, the actual parcels?
There are about there are about 300,000 homes in Portland. In number of parcels, I couldn't tell you off the top. It's 70% of the parcels.
Yeah, so call it 200,000 maybe.
Sure.
Yeah. So we use a 2% rule, which is if it's by right and the rules are pretty not onerous, like Palisades Park and some of these other places we've talked about, then you can convert just through the process of the market, and assuming it's economically feasible, about 2% a year. So that would be, notionally about 4,000. So you said they had 280. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's building. But that would sort of notionally be what you get to, assuming the economics work. And that's what Palisades Park, as this is demonstrated, because the economics pretty much worked everywhere there. And there were, the entire town was zoned 1 and 2 family, but 95% of it was 1 family, and that converted over time at a rate of about 2% a year. So Nolan, now let's shift to California. So California has SB 9, SB 10. Can you give us sort of the lay of the land of what you think they've done right, what they've done wrong, and what's the prognosis for, to the extent something's been done wrong, fixing it?
Yeah, well, this was teased a little bit in the talk that you all gave earlier, and I talked about this in Fresno. Land use reform is a process, right? You're not going to pass a perfect bill. With ADUs, we spent 30 years trying to legalize them, and then in a span of 5 years actually successfully legalized them here in California. SB9 was a big bill, freaked a lot of people out, excited a lot of people. It was politically difficult, had to make compromises to get something through. But I don't think anyone passed the bill with the notion that, we're going to pass it and we're going to move forward. I think one of the great things that's happening right now is every exclusionary jurisdiction in California is showing us all the ways that we have to fix the bill with all the creative mechanisms that they're relying on to block SB9 projects. So we're tracking that, and we're talking to the folks who want to build these units and other folks in this research space. So I think that's really exciting. There's a lot of opportunities there. I think SB9 is also a little bit different from ADUs. I think part of the reason you had explosive growth immediately with ADUs was that this was a known typology. And in fact, here in Los Angeles, there were many tens of thousands of ADUs that already existed that were unpermitted. So people knew what these were. There were contractors who knew how to build these things. So it was very easy, I think, to immediately have an ADU building boom. I think with SB9, we're building kind of a new typology, a novel sort of form of missing middle infill. And I think there's a little bit of a learning process there, even beyond getting the regulations right. But so, we're constantly talking to folks, and we're always hearing about new ways that we can streamline the process. SB 10, I think, is interesting. I think the real value from SB 10 is going to come from giving jurisdictions a mechanism to comply with RENA and do some of the low-rise multifamily upzonings that they're going to have to do, exempt from CEQA. And I think it's part of the broader reform process that we've been a part of here in California, of removing some of these unnecessary environmental review hurdles for projects where not only do we know they're not going to have a serious environmental impact, but actually it's very good for the environment if we have more 10-unit per lot infill, or more duplexes, more fourplexes. I think the way I always think of what we're doing, and I'm following in the footsteps of people who have done amazing stuff here, what we're doing in California is we're really rolling back 50 years of just a completely broken planning framework. And I think we're fixing elements of this. We're fixing elements of this with RENA, with CEQA, with putting guardrails around local planning. And so it's a process.
Thank you. You mentioned all of the illegal ADUs. It reminds me that my son and his wife were looking at houses in D.C. area, and half the houses we went to had these basement units that were not legal. So even NIMBYs like density, even illegal density, as long as it's in their house, I guess.
Well, and I'll just say another quick point on this real quick, right? For folks who are visiting LA, if you pull up to every single intersection in LA, there's going to be a bunch of signs illegally posted up on the on the traffic posts, fix your credit, cheap or free divorce, and then I'll build an ADU for you, right? Whenever I see those signs, I'm reminded of that is what successful reform looks like, and hopefully we'll get to a place where we, under free divorce consultation, we'll have free SB9 consultation.
Okay, Ethan. So we're at what I call my cousin Vinny moment, where he says to the inspector, tell us the answer. And so you gave some great presentation on the panel that we had in Riverside earlier today. Just give us the facts that you went through and the arguments you went through.
That's a pretty open statement, isn't it? Let me start by asking a question. How many of you have had a grandmother that you love? Anyone have? Good.
Yeah.
I just want to start in the happy space right there, right? Because not only can you get a quick divorce on the corner or an ADU, you might see some people that the Salvation Army serves there too. It's interesting to me, the question of NIMBYism, which I'm learning is not in my something, or rather, not in your backyard. Yours specifically? Yeah, so it's interesting that we've somewhat in some cities have traded NIMBYism really for a new approach to housing, which would be storefront, sidewalk, and park place, right? So we've replaced the not my backyard, so instead we put it on our front door. And in that, in California, what we would recognize is that 64% of those people who are experiencing homelessness are actually experiencing a reversible homelessness, which is short-term, less than 18 months, which means that they were actually in your backyard 18 months ago when you called them neighbor and friend. And that pauses us for a moment, because we think about the 36% of chronic, which is a decline from your neighbor. And maybe your neighbor has had a crisis or two, but most people who suffer from addiction live in housing. And most people who have a mental health crisis have family, friends, or a support network. But if you don't have housing for a support network, then you live your crisis out on the storefront, sidewalk, or park place location. In California, the argument is, and it was the same in Sarasota, right, is these are not our neighbors, they're from somewhere else. It's one of our favorite arguments. We know they're from somewhere else because our neighbors would never live at the front door. But what you find in California is about 91% of them are your neighbors. Now, I loved my grandmothers. I loved both of them, but I had a favorite. I never told them. How long should a grandmother live on the streets of California before they get into housing as we determine policy? The truth is in California, like a lot of the country, we recognize that chronic homelessness for that 36% is essentially a 30-year death sentence. Grandmothers don't live on your streets because they die before that. So on average, those who die on the streets are younger than 55 because of advanced aging of living on the streets. And so as we do this, part of what a passion for me is how do you reframe the conversation to say that our neighbors that lived behind us last year should live next to us next year? That they are our neighbors and they need to come in. And by removing that pressure off the system can actually better absorb the 36% that needs the system's resources. So by housing and filling in a middle housing, by creating that space, we actually relieve a lot of other social ills that we do not connect well from policy or data. Instead, we connect it from sensationalism, fatalism, and the news. And so there's a better way to frame that, which allows cities to change their results.
That's exactly what I was expecting. Thank you. So this question is Los Angeles has been a state leader in ADU adoption, and hopefully it can also be for SB 9. But what's your view on whether LA will actually be a leader for SB 9, and what conditions exist in LA that made it such a hotbed for ADUs? And I've just started with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think first there was already this local tradition of building ADUs. We had a lot of ADUs that were already here. People knew what they were. They knew how to build them. Of course, the existing LA housing stock is uniquely amenable to ADUs, so most people have large backyards that they're not really using. Those are dynamics that are going to help with SB 9. You know, I think we talk a lot about state preemption, and I do think we need to tighten the rules with things like SB 9 and streamline it and add some of the protections that we already afford to ADUs. But we also need local partners on this, right? We need local governments to embrace this process and make it very easy to get an SB 9 permit. You know, SB 9 projects in many cases, certainly with the owner occupancy requirement, are going to be like ADU projects in that it's not going to be a big developer. It might be a homeowner applying for some of these permits, or a homeowner working with a company that might have more sophistication but doesn't have the bandwidth to undertake a 6-month-long permitting process. So, you know, I think the success of this program in LA is really going to hinge on, do we make it fast, affordable, and reliable to get an SB 9 permit? And if we can do that, I think we can leverage this law and get a whole bunch of housing built in a way that doesn't really change neighborhoods in a really meaningful way, right? I think a lot of this stuff would be just essentially using those unused backyards that are just sitting vacant, and you know, like was just being said, pulling people off the street.
Emily?
Yeah, I think that, as others have said, we need some more iterations on SB 9 to get it to a place where it is facilitating that scalable development. It's interesting, I think, looking at cities across California, some places that seem to have a housing stock a lot like LA and market fundamentals much like LA are seeing a much lower level of ADU permitting for reasons that from the East Coast at least are kind of inscrutable. So I think it's really important that in this environment of state preemption, which I do think is essential to reaching the level of housing abundance that we all want to see, that local leaders are also coming along, where we see LA leaders really cooperating with the spirit of the state law that we're unfortunately not yet seeing in some other places.
Looking at the companies that are making these plexes work in Portland, there are two that are sort of really trying to scale it up. So I will tell you, based on their experience, what they've seen specifically is working, and maybe that'll inform the conversation here. It's going to echo a lot of what David said earlier, but size is the biggest single thing in determining viability. One thing we did, as David mentioned, in Portland was we said if there are more units on a lot, then you're allowed to have more building on a lot. The buildings are allowed to be larger. That tilts the market toward these less expensive homes, even if the project itself is larger, and so therefore it's economically feasible. Rechannels the market in the direction of the less expensive homes. Another is parking. 0 of the new buildings that the folks are working on in these two dedicated companies have any on-site parking. Portland, when it did this, it removed parking mandates from the low-density areas, and people are relying on street parking for their housing near here. That's not the way it works everywhere, but that's the way it's been working so far under our rules. So it's very important to leave that as an option. Ownership, 100% of these two companies are condo products. I think that is, I was talking to a woman who's got a smaller firm with her husband. She's the developer. He's the handyman and carpenter guy. She said, like, my husband is worth so much more working on a third-party job than he is going to fix something at one of our properties. She's trying to maintain scattered site rentals around town. And like, it's like he's losing money every time he goes out to do it because he has to spend time driving all around town. The better, more often viable model, I think, is an ownership model where these lower cost homes are going into lowering the barriers to homeownership, and people are fixing them for themselves. So looking for the options that can allow homeownership, whether that's through a condo or a lot split, is going to make that much more viable in more cases. And then 5, near parks and schools. These folks, both of these companies, they said they independently discovered the places that we're looking are the places within a few blocks of an open space where somebody can walk their dog. And one way to think about that, to the equity question earlier, is I think, like, we have these public spaces. We've invested a ton in making parks that are ringed by single-family homes, at least in Portland. That's what a ton of the parks land and school land is. Why on earth is the public investment being wasted to such an extent? We talk a lot about transit-oriented development. I would love to see more park-oriented development. And I'd also actually love to see grocery store-oriented development. I think we should have zone around grocery stores. Anyway, that's just me.
Thank you. Ethan, yep.
Sure, I was thinking about my grandmother. I got lost in
Which one do you like?
I got lost in that for a moment. What's interesting is, as we look at, okay, where do we put housing and where do we put people? There's a few things that confuse my mind, and maybe you can help me with it, if you'd be so kind. One is when the government intercedes in California to do affordable housing, the reports are that your ADU costs are like really low, but your cost per door on government assisted housing starts at like $400,000, and your LA Times reported multiple projects where it's $1 million a door. So it's confusing to me that when we build homes in the community, it's like under $200,000. And after the storm, by the way, we did LEED Platinum homes at 800 square feet for about $120,000. It was amazing. But your neighborhood home is about $200,000. Your assisted home starts at $400,000 and up to $1 million, and no one connects those dots. I'm just reading Cal Matters, so it's only public information. It's not like I came up with it. It's just a bit confusing to me. And so then people say, well, where do you put homes? Well, that one's confusing to me too. Do I have time for a short story?
Sure.
Thanks. So David Cross, right? I was in the meanest city in the U.S. is what they were known for. Great title from USA. There were some people in the city who were like, yes, we're the meanest city. No one else will come. That's not true. It just means we got sued a lot. And so one of the gentlemen who sued us, he lived under the portico at the library, which is beautiful, multi-million-dollar condos above him. We couldn't get him to move. I said, David, nice guy. He was very likable, looked like Santa Claus, had no mental health issues. He just lived there. He drank Starbucks with me every morning with all the people at the condo. And I'm like, I want you to move. He's like, I won't do it. Well, finally, he was ready to come in, and there's 3 things that he required. One is he wanted to make sure he had access to the library. It's the reason why he lived under the portico at the library. He likes to read. 2, he wanted access to Starbucks every morning because it's where he drank coffee for years. And then the 3rd was his home. The issue is that as we serve people in our communities and areas, we need to put housing where the people want to be because the value of the community is so rich that to leave it is a higher cost to them than they're willing to pay. And how do you know? Because they're choosing still to live in California. They're choosing still to live here. If it wasn't true, they could use the money that they get federally and live somewhere where it's affordable. But they don't. They stay because this is home. And that's how we decide where to put housing.
Okay, we're going to turn to questions. So again, raise your hand, wait for the mic.
Hey, I had a question for Mike about Portland, and I feel like a lesson from the ADUs in California and maybe Portland as well is, and comparing that to SB9, is this like incremental additional, the way you can build without tearing down what you have. And I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit. I read a few of your articles on this subject and how, Portland has this program where you can build up to 4 units, but it doesn't require this like complicated lot split and almost like in every case you would have to tear down the existing home, live somewhere else for a while, build 2 separate buildings. Whereas in Portland, you can just like kind of anywhere you want in your backyard, build an extra 1 or 2 units or throw a trailer in there, whatever works. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
I wish Portland were quite as beautiful as you described, Shane. But sure. So like the number one critique every single person has, I think probably, about these middle housing bills is it's going to lead to the teardown of the cheapest home on the block, right? Which is true. That is the lot that's going to, of all the houses on each block that's going to be redeveloped, it's going to be the cheapest home on the block. Now, that unit may have already been destined for being torn down to build a giant one-plex anyway, right? But still, it's worth thinking about. So what if we could have an option that would let the owner of that lot add value to that lot without knocking down the cheapest home on the block if it is, in fact, still, a feasible unit, if it's not in terrible condition? That's great. That's a win for everybody. That's a win for the environment, right? But we don't always think about which assumptions get in the way of that. So when I started talking about duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, it never occurred to me that we could just be like, what about could we have a full-size unit in the backyard? Then we wouldn't have to knock down the front thing. So a year after Portland passed that first package of reforms, we came back and we simplified the process for doing lot splits, specifically with the sort of low wealth, land rich, or low cash poor, land rich household in mind. Like, how are you going to get the capital to build a lot, or build a unit in the backyard? What if you could lop it off and finance it with a 30-year mortgage? That's a very effective way to get the money to build a unit if you don't have a lot of cash.
I would note that some of our research shows that it's, again, if the cheapest house on the block, if the land price is sufficiently high, so the house is still the cheapest house, but it's all land, if you can build at the right density, for example, that fourplex that was and that was on the 12,000 square foot lot in Charlotte, you actually ended up with 4 houses at $440,000, and the cheapest house on the block was $400,000, but it was probably 80 years old. and instead you got a 1,400 square foot, $440,000 house, but you got 4 of them instead of the McMansion. So next question, please.
Nolan, I think probably for you, I've absorbed all the restrictions and sort of the roadblocks of SB 9, SB 10 that we've seen. I get the sort of the concepts on paper of why it's good. Have you had any feedback yet on like a city that really likes it, that is excited about it and implementing it yet, or is it still just a little bit too new? Like what's getting traction on it? What are the ideas that cities are excited about or city planners excited about specifically?
That's a really good question. I don't think I could point you to a city that's excited about SB 9, to be honest with you. I would say most of the planners who I interact with feel good about it. They know it needs to be done. They want more state support to make programs that work. They might be dealing with local politics that make it to where they can't put the resources they need into SB 9. So, I'd say among a lot of the planning practitioners who I talk to, they like it. They know, they think this is a viable path to infill housing production. I think, unfortunately, we're not quite there yet where we have cities embracing it, but I think it's a similar dynamic with ADUs. It took time for cities to actually realize that this is not just like the state forcing you to eat your vegetables, but this is an opportunity to, facilitate a lot of infill and create wealth building opportunities for existing homeowners. So, I think another element of what's going on too is that I talk to a lot of developers who are like, well, I tried to do an SB 9 project in this jurisdiction or this town, and they hadn't even adopted an ordinance. Of course, every jurisdiction was supposed to have adopted an ordinance by January 1st of this year, and many haven't. Of course, many have no landing pages, many have no dedicated person managing the permits. Yeah, it sucks. I mean, the people who are the first round of applicants are, in many cases, you are the reason why these cities are going to create these processes. So I always say to the folks who are still kind of playing in the sandbox, like, keep pushing. Like, you could be the reason why a particular suburb says, okay, actually we need to hire someone to manage SB 9 permits, or we need a SB 9 landing page, or we need to think through how we're going to process these things. And of course, as we refine state law and it becomes just easier to build these things, there's going to be more impetus on cities to embrace the program.
Next question over here, please.
Hi, I'm Tony Gittleson with the Livable Communities Initiative, which is an initiative that's actually gaining traction here in LA. I won't talk about that. Thank you for the great presentation. But talking about affordability and equity, especially with the gentle density, what empirical evidence are we seeing that, in fact, rents are coming down where we are building ADUs and townhomes? The filtering effect, because I'm in a debate with my neighbors, or one in particular. It sounds suspiciously like trickle down. I know it works because I built by accident. We have an ADU, and I know I'm renting it for less than the luxury building up the street. But what kind of empirical data are you seeing on that supports it? And two, I'm also debating with my neighbor quite heatedly the character of the neighborhood. So, and it's he's an old friend. But design standards, I would agree. You need more density, some more height. It's a tricky balance, especially with community plans. So 2 questions, kind of. Thank you.
Maybe I can tag team with Emily on this, right? Because I'm going to use her data, so I might as well give her credit for it. You thought the Salvation Army guy would answer the empirical data question, didn't you? Right? So the U.S. is going to celebrate Houston for the next year or two as a community that has reduced on-street level living by 25,000 people in the last 10 years, 8,000 in the last couple, by focusing on systems, continuum of care that move people quickly through street living into housing. They did that in large part because of the empirical data that Emily is going to share with you. How'd I do?
I'll tag team with Nolan as well, maybe. Houston builds tons of every type of housing, multifamily, greenfield single family, also lots of infill townhouses. So as part of all of those types of housing playing a part, the median house price in Houston is below the national median, even though it's been growing faster than the rest of the country on average for several decades. And I think one piece of that is definitely the infill townhouse. You can buy a new construction townhouse in parts of Houston for about $300,000, which seems incredibly appealing from the Los Angeles perspective.
So before you continue, Emily, I believe you did some work on LA ADUs and what they rented for compared to similarly sized units that were regular apartments.
Yeah, as your anecdote shows, that is the case on average. I can't speak to the LA numbers specifically off the top of my head, but ADUs definitely tend to be cheaper than comparably sized apartments in the same neighborhood. That's certainly true in DC as well.
Nolan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an urban economist, but smaller homes that consume less land are cheaper than bigger homes that consume more land. I think it's almost too obvious to state, but you hear this, people will say, like, we can't legalize townhouses on this block where we only allow single-family homes on 10,000 square foot lots because the townhouses aren't going to be affordable. And I think, look around you. Like, look at the existing stock is not affordable. I mean, more seriously, to the ADU point, we know that most ADUs are actually being rented at rates that would be considered affordable, rates that are affordable to households earning 80% or less than the area median income. Turner has some great work on this, and I think the Southern California Association of Governments estimates that like 2/3 of ADUs built rent to people earning below 80% AMI. So this is effectively affordable housing that's being built at no cost to the taxpayer. It's homeowners who eagerly want to do it. And you know, of course, we say 2/3 are below 80% AMI. Many of those units are being let out to aging parents or being let out to young adult children who otherwise wouldn't have been able to afford to stay in Southern California.
So that's why we call it naturally affordable. And there are lots of data, and if you give one of us your contact information, we'll try to dig some out for you. But as Nolan said, that the Tobias went through for single-family detached. We have similar graphics for single-family attached for not as many counties, because single-family detached tends to be less plentiful, obviously, than detached. But we have similar graphics for that, and it's a little bit noisier, but it basically shows the same gradient. And there's some places that we haven't had a chance to really dig into it, but they're very odd relationships. So what the normal relationship is, if you take that one for single-family detached that went from the largest gross living area to the lowest, and then the prices went down accordingly, and if you put it on the same page, which you can do on our tool, the single-family attached just continues right along. So whatever the minimum size of the gross living area, let's say it was 2,000 square feet, the single-family attached picks up right around 2,000 square feet, and then the gradient just continues. The price also picks up at about the same price as the single-family attached. So the most expensive single-family attached ends up being the least expensive single-family detached, and then that gradient continues down. We also looked at condominiums because you can't figure out what the land share is for a condominium easily, we had to focus on things like number of bedrooms versus square footage versus price, and we found a very strong gradient there also. So, the common sense intuition is that, yes, if you build something that is smaller on less land, it will have a lower price, and we can now demonstrate that in just about every place in the United States. Question, Annie?
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Emily and Nolan's comments about the ADU prices and sort of how they're lower than comparable apartments, in a given neighborhood. Do you have also data on ADUs that are just on the market? Because it seems like a lot of those ADUs that are informally rented to family members at low or no rent would really meaningfully skew that rent down in a data set. And I'd love to know, on the market, are ADUs on the market exactly comparable, or are they a little more, or they are a little less when you take out those sort of like non-market renters, for lack of a better term?
In DC, it's the case that ADUs on the market are generally about $300-ish less than, say, a one-bedroom basement apartment is going to be a few $100s less a month than a one-bedroom on-the-market apartment in the same neighborhood. I think that probably the most systematic research on ADU rental rates is from the Turner Center. I don't know if we can turn it over to David.
Tag team.
Yeah, the research we've done, so I'll take a step back. We have an ADU, cool, that's neat. We did a survey of ADU owners, which included what they are renting the units for, and we included the numbers for those that are on the market. I've heard the exact split, but I think it's almost 50% are rented at pretty much no amount because they're given to family members, caretakers, or otherwise people they have an arm's length relationship with. So yeah, but on average, it's depending on the region, it's right at median for rental prices.
We'll take one more question and then we'll start the breakout sessions. Yep, we have a question over here. Yeah, you want to help there?
Hello.
Yep, there you go.
So my question is just related to has anyone looked at the price of housing of property within an area as a result of ADUs being legalized? I'm just wondering. I understand that ADUs provide more housing within an area, so ultimately it brings affordability to an area. But just I'm a little curious to see if it raises the barrier to entry for people to buy property within an area, because all of a sudden you have a property that was once maybe a single family home and it has 2 ADUs on it. So all of a sudden it's kind of like a little landlord business that somebody could own, which is great for density, but it might harm some, middle class wealth building opportunities. So I'm just wondering if anyone's looked at that relation.
Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, Emily could probably speak to this as well, but so sure, you would expect some of that added value to be capitalized in higher land prices that you can now just build more units on the same property. Of course, it's higher value because you can build a new home and charge rent, and that, of course, is going to increase overall supply. I'm not aware of research on the effect of like local market rents from ADU production, but I was actually trying to find something on this earlier this week. I would say this is where we need more than one policy here, right? So I think this is the value of something like a beefed up SB9, is that we're going to create more of those owner occupancy opportunities. So for example, under the ADU framework, you can take your backyard and you can build an ADU and you can rent it out. Under the SB9 framework, if we get it right, you'll be able to take your backyard, lot split it, somebody else has a home ownership opportunity. I think there's different policies to pursue different objectives, and I hear you that we need to think a lot about owner occupancy opportunities. And I think back to the SB9 point, one of the issues too we're thinking about is condo mapping and making sure that you can take duplexes and turn those into condos in the way that you had in Palisades Park that created another owner occupancy typology. Emily might have some thoughts on this.
I think there might be an argument to expand financing options to make it easier for the income from that ADU to help homeowners qualify to purchase those, similar to products that allow someone to buy a duplex and rent out the other half while counting that projected income from that other half of the duplex toward their mortgage qualifications.
So I would note 2 things. One is when all of those illegal ADUs were being done, no one was complaining about the impact. They were just wanting to get to the having the ADUs. The other is we have done some work on light touch density, which in some cases could have included ADUs, but mostly just it included other types of topologies, 2, 3, 4 townhouses, et cetera. And so in the Charlotte example, we showed what the prices were, and they were much lower. The price appreciation was basically the same. And we also looked at the two zoning examples in Seattle, and I think there was a chart on that that shows that up until the pandemic hit, the small multifamily zoned area that was new, the homes were going up at the same pace as the single family only area. They were just going up in lockstep. That deviated a bit when the pandemic hit. We don't know why. People might have wanted a little more space. That was a common theme. But up until that point, they were just going up in lockstep. So I want to thank our panel and give them a round of applause. We have 4 breakout sessions that are listed on your schedule, and we've got signs that where they are, and just pick your session. And as people gather, just bring extra chairs as needed, and we'll get the breakout sessions going. If I can have everyone's attention, I want to thank everyone for attending. This has been a spirited discussion. I want to again thank the Hilton Foundation for supporting our work. We have representatives from the Hilton Foundation here. Please engage with them during the reception. We thank all of our supporters at AEI that support the research that the Housing Center undertakes. We've really appreciated your coming here, your sharing your ideas, listening to all of our speakers. We thank all of the speakers, and we are now ready to adjourn right out this door for our reception. But again, thank you for attending, and thank you for your attention.